Okay, I'm going to let everybody in.
Okay.
Okay, great. Believe everybody's in the meeting now. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for attending today's Indiana Main Street November Lunch and Discuss. We have a special guest today. So just to introduce myself, my name is Shelby Farthing. I'm the new Community and Economic Development Program Manager here at the Office of Community and Rural Affairs. Both of our Main Street Abbeys are out on the road today visiting communities, so thought this was a good chance for me to introduce myself to everybody. Admit this person. So yeah, thanks so much. Today we have George Hanlin, Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities, who is going to talk about grant writing tips and tricks. And he's going to talk about grant applications and best practices for grant writing. So I'm going to hand it off to George. We're going to wait until the end to take any questions unless George stops and asks for that, but I'm going to keep everybody's camera and mics off. So we're just going to use the chat function today to do questions. So thanks everyone. I'll let George take it from here.
Thank you, Shelby. It's nice to join you all today. Just to confirm, everybody can see the screen I'm sharing. Is that correct? I trust it's correct. So we'll assume that you can. I'm glad to be talking to you all today. My name is George Hanlin. I'm Director of Grants at Indiana Humanities. And Abby from Okra asked me to do this quite some time ago, and we kind of got delayed. So finally, here we are several months after we first talked about this idea, and I have the opportunity to meet with you and talk to you about writing grant proposals. Today's agenda, we'll just go over the slide real quickly. I'm going to take just a minute or so to talk to you a little bit about the organization I work for and my background, so you know a little bit about the person to whom you're speaking or the person that's speaking to you today, and what some of my experiences are. Then the bulk of the presentation is to talk to you just about writing grant proposals, but also just more broadly seeking grants. So hopefully that information, that broad perspective will be helpful to you. And then, as Shelby said, we'll take time at the end to answer your questions. I will say, pop your questions as they come up into the chat. I may pause from time to time and take questions. Maybe it'll be easier to answer them as we go along. So do feel free to pop them in chat, and I'll try to pause every once in a while and have Shelby read them to me. I hope to talk about a half an hour. I'll need to watch my time. To be honest, I've not practiced this presentation yet. I just wrote it, finished it up last night, and I feel like I didn't really practice it. So I do plan to talk about a half an hour or so and leave some time for questions at the end. So I hope that's agreeable. It's a little strange not seeing your faces. I'm talking to a bunch of just initials of your first and last names on the screen. So bear with me. Okay, the introduction. As I mentioned, I'd just like to tell a little bit about our organization and who I am. I work for a group called Indiana Humanities. We are a nonprofit located in Indianapolis, but we work statewide, and our goal is to promote the public humanities, to engage people across the state of Indiana in humanities programming. And you may be asking yourself, what exactly are the humanities? They are the cultural programs that aren't the arts. So subjects like history or literature or archaeology, languages, world cultures, that sort of thing. Just like the Indiana Arts Commission promotes arts and artists, we do the same thing for the humanities. So we have a programming team here that puts programs around the state. My job at Indiana Humanities is to provide grants. We're a small staff of about 15. We serve 6.8 million Hoosiers. And as much programming as we put on, we just don't have the resources to be everywhere all at once. So one of the ways that we try to address getting across the state is by offering some small grants to organizations like libraries and historical societies and museums. Schools can apply for grants, government agencies, and yes, even Main Street programs like you. We've given a number of grants to Main Street programs. Some programs that come to mind, we gave recently a grant to Columbia City to do a walking tour, a digital walking tour of downtown. Heart of Lebanon received a grant also to do some walking tours around the community. We paired with Okra to do, we've paired with them last few years to provide some funding for their Preserving Main Street program. So in those cases, we've worked with Brookville, with Kindleville. Now we're working with Newcastle. So we have some experience working with some of your Main Street programs. And I just admire the work that you're doing and am glad to talk to you at any point about grants that we have available and how we can support your work. So keep that in mind. I will put my contact information on the very last slide. I will also say that I will share these slides with Shelby. So if she wants to send them out to you all so you can have them, we can definitely do that. Now, a little bit about me, my experience, and what I bring to the table in today's conversation. I will say that I have been the director of grants at Indiana Humanities for 8 years. I joined the staff in 2016. Before that, I've had stints at the Indiana Historical Society and a private nonprofit, or a private HR consulting business, I should say. I didn't come from a solid grants background. I was kind of new to grants when I came. So in some ways, I think that's helpful because, like you, I kind of came into it new and kind of learned my way. Although I will point out that I do have a background in nonprofit management. I have a master's degree from IU Indianapolis. And as part of that nonprofit management class, that program, I did take some fundraising courses. So I was familiar with the concept. I've also been a grant reviewer for organizations like the Indiana Arts Commission, and I've worked for small nonprofits where I've helped write grant proposals. So I have the experience as a grant administrator, but also as a grant seeker and a reviewer of grants. So I hope that's helpful background for you today as I talk through my presentation. Any questions that have popped up? I don't assume so, Shelby, during this introduction, but if so, I'd be glad to pause now. Doesn't sound like it. So we'll go ahead and go into the heart of what you're really here for, to learn about seeking grants and writing effective grant proposals. Now, notice I talk about grants and grant proposals. A lot of people say when they're applying for funds, oh, I'm going to write a grant. Well, you're really not. You're writing an application for a grant or a proposal for a grant. The organization giving the money, they're making a grant. So really, when you are seeking a grant, you're writing a grant proposal or a grant application, not the grant itself. So you'll hear me say grant proposal or grant applications, and that's why I do that, because you're really not writing a grant when you apply for a grant. You're seeking the grant, and the money that we award is a grant. So some distinction there. So first things, I'm going to take a higher level view in this presentation and not just immediately jump into applying for grants. I do want to talk about how do you decide whether a grant is right for you, and even just laying the groundwork for seeking the funding. So I think before you even start thinking about seeking grants, applying for grants, that you really need to take a broad look at what are your needs for funds, right? What do you need support for? And I'm sure you do this every year as you plan your annual budget. You have to decide what are we going to do this year. Obviously, you're going to need some money for operating support. So that is a huge part of your funding, your staff salaries, your rent, your insurance, your utilities, things like that. But you also need to decide, okay, what programs are we going to put on? Are we going to do special programs like maybe having a sort of a holiday visit downtown, visit with Santa Claus or something like that? Are you going to maybe do some other sort of festival type programming? Maybe you have a historic theater and you want to do some sort of film festival. The idea is that you want to think about where are you going to need funding. You may have some capital improvements that you want to do. Maybe you're in an older building and you need to replace the roof, or it's time for new computer equipment, things like that. I'm sure at Main Street, a lot of your programming or a lot of your work is probably centered on promotional activities, like getting people to come downtown, to shop downtown, to visit downtown, that sort of thing. So I would imagine you may have a lot of funds that go towards marketing and things like that. In any case, you'll want to figure out what's your budget for the year and where do you need the funds. What are your priorities for raising funds specifically? I don't know where all your sources for your funding come from. I'm not that familiar with Main Street programs. I imagine you may get some community support. Maybe your local government supports you. But I do think as you think about what you're going to spend money for on, start figuring out where the income coming from. Grants are definitely a way that you can raise money. It's not the only way. You may, as I mentioned, you may get some government support, corporate support. I would imagine that a lot of you work with some of your downtown businesses and seek corporate support. Don't overlook individual support. When I was in in the nonprofit management course, that's been 20 years ago, so the data may be a little flawed by now, but back then, all fundraising, about 70% of fundraising came from individual support. So keep that in mind as well. Of course, there may be other ways that you're going to get some revenue. Or for the funds, and where are we going to sort of pair up support grants that will provide operating support? If you can do that, great. That's sort of like the golden egg. If you can find grant funds that are unrestricted and you can use them toward operating funds, go for it. Those are sometimes hard. A lot of times grant makers will want to have a particular program in mind or some special purpose and not provide funding just generally for operating support. There are some, so just keep that in mind, but think about what you're going to do. If it's a program, would this be a great opportunity for a grant? Maybe it's a program that's better suited for corporate support. Maybe it might be easier to raise individual dollars for the program rather than spending the time and money, energy on writing proposals. I will emphasize that writing grant proposals does take a lot of resources. It does take time. It does take, energy, a lot of time to review and put it all together. I have often applied for grants and they've been very labor intensive. And I've thought to myself, it would be easier just to seek individual support, go to a few people in the community and get some money for this. So keep that in mind as you're trying to put the pieces of the puzzle together. What programs do you need funds for? What are the best opportunities to raise money for the particular programs or the operating support or whatever it is that you're looking for? That's important to sort of lay the roadmap out. Again, grants will be great for some things. Grants may not be the right source for a lot of the work that you do. So having that in mind will be helpful. Now, let's say that you do decide that you have a particular program, particular activity, maybe even a good source for operating support, and you do want to apply for a grant. It's important to do some research before you begin the process to figure out what's out there to support this particular need, right? You will probably already work with some organizations that you know are good grant makers and you have a relationship, and that's great. You can kind of pair them up and say, well, we know the Community Foundation does provide us with some operating support. So this year we're going to apply for $10,000 for operating support. Or we know that we have a family foundation in the community that really likes children activities. So, we do have the meet and greet with Santa Claus or the summer downtown reading program with the library or something like that. And you may already have in mind some organizations that have in the past supported you, and that's your go-to. But as you think about expanding your fundraising, it's a good idea to open up the doors a bit, look at what's out there, find some other resources. So how do you do that? Well, one way that you can do that is you can go and look at online databases. There are things like Foundation Directory, grantwatch.com, grants.gov, which is about government grants. These resources it's a database of organizations that make grants and the sort of things that they support. I will say that grants.gov is free since that's for government grants. These other ones, often they're paid services. You have to subscribe. I'm not sure how expensive they can be. That could be expensive. One thing that you might do is go see if there's a library subscription somewhere. If you're from a smaller community, chances are your small local library won't have a subscription to Foundation Directory. But let's say you're near Fort Wayne. Maybe the Allen County Public Library does. I know down at Indianapolis at the IU School of Philanthropy, they've got grant databases. Maybe you could, if it's worth your while and you're going to be in Indianapolis, pop by the library and use the source for free. But that is a good way to find out certain grant makers. Of course, the internet search is a good way to find them. We happen to work in a historic home here in Indianapolis. I'm always trying to raise money to do repairs on the house. So, I often will just get online, Google historic preservation grants, Indiana, or historic preservation grants, Midwest. And I have found, some organizations that I wasn't necessarily aware of. So sometimes a simple internet search will be helpful as you're looking for sources. Subscribe to organizations like your newsletters that serve your community. I'm sure that many of you subscribe to Main Street America, their newsletter. I'm hoping you're getting Okra's e-newsletters, things like that. Sometimes these e-newsletters will include funding sources. A really good one, and I do have a link to it later. We'll talk a little bit more about it. The Indiana Historical Society's Communique Online is a weekly e-newsletter specifically for local historical societies. But the good news is they have all sorts of grant opportunities that could be for organizations not just history related. They also have some training opportunities, and that I'll mention that later. But subscribe to e-newsletters that deal with either your industry or maybe just more broadly nonprofit or fundraising. I get something called Grants News Watch, an e-newsletter. I don't know how I did subscribe to it. It starts coming, but I look at it from time to time, and it does list organizations that have received grants, some grant opportunities. So look at what e-newsletters are out there. I have a bullet here called spying on your competitors. And I don't know if that's really the right terminology, but one thing that I do, and I will point out that I do have to raise funds here at Indiana Humanities. That's part of our job. Again, we're a nonprofit. We go out and raise money. One of the things that I do is I look at what other organizations are getting funding for. So I'll pick up the Indiana State Museum's annual report or the Indiana Historical Society's annual report, or check out their e-news and see who's sponsoring exhibitions, who is giving them money for XYZ. And I'm like, oh, here's a foundation I've never heard of before. I'm going to get online and Google and see what they're all about. Looking at what other groups similar to you are, where they're getting funding, is a good opportunity to find some leads. That's not just good for grants, I will say. It's also a great resource for individual donors. Like, oh, I see that so-and-so gave $50,000 to the Indiana Historical Society. Well, let me start checking into that person and see what more broadly, their interest in the humanities might be. So kind of spying on your neighbors, your friends, is a helpful thing when you're raising money. Also, I will just say, as you're seeking grant opportunities, ask your friends, ask your board members, hey, are you familiar with any grants that we could apply for? Talk to your Okra community liaisons. Are you aware of anything? Have you seen anything that might apply to this program that we're wanting to do here in Main Street, Lagodi, or wherever you may be? Never underestimate the power of your network and the people that you work with. So use them as a source for finding grants. I'll pause. Any questions that have popped in chat up to now?
No, not yet.
Okay, great. Okay, so you've done some research. You've identified programs, opportunities that you need some funding for, and you've started to narrow in some grant opportunities. What's the next step now? The next step is to understand that grant that you're interested in. Most grant makers, they have a purpose for making their grants, right? There's some sort of objective that they want to achieve. Most grants have some sort of guidelines, some stipulations about these are the sort of things that we're going to fund with this grant. This is what we're wanting to accomplish with this grant. And your challenge as the grant seeker is to figure that out. So what I would say is, first of all, if you find a grant opportunity that you think might work for some of your needs, dig in, find out as much as you can about the organization making the grant. If you see that there's a grant here at Indiana Humanities that you want to apply for, I encourage you, for example, to visit Indiana Humanities webpage. Read about our mission, read about our vision, read about our values, find out what's important to us, look at our programs that we put on so you get a good feel for what we identify as humanities programming. Take a look at our individual grants. We offer a number of different grants, and read the guidelines. Most good grant makers will provide you with some information about the grant that they're making. They'll provide you with guidelines to say specifically, this is what this grant is about. These are the sort of things that we fund with this grant. It may say, these are the things that we don't fund with this grant. Could say, these are activities that are restricted. You cannot use grant funds for X, Y, Z. If the guidelines are good, they'll talk about deadlines, when to apply, things like that. In addition to learning about the organization, read about the various grants that they have available. Maybe an organization just only offers one kind of grant. But if it's like Indiana Humanities, we have, again, several different grants with different purposes. So take the time to read guidelines thoroughly. I happen to think at Indiana Humanities, we provide pretty thorough grant guidelines. I mean, they're sometimes 12 pages long. They will mention about what the grant's about. They will give examples of some of the projects that we've funded with the grants in the past, or potential examples of programs we could support. Because we are re-granting federal funds, there are things that we can't spend money on. And we lay out all the restrictions. This is what you cannot use grant dollars for. We're pretty specific about when the deadline is, when you can apply, how long the review process is going to take, what the review process looks like. I even include in the grant guidelines the questions that you're going to have to answer. And then I also include a sample budget and the scoring rubric. So if you look at our guidelines at Indiana Humanities, you're going to come away with a pretty good feel of what we're seeking, and you're going to know what you're going to need to put together to complete the grant application. Not everybody's going to be that thorough. I've gone before and looked at grant opportunities, and I might find a couple of paragraphs at best on their website. So know that, do your best to find information. Sometimes it won't be available as readily as maybe others are, like ours. So in that case, what I would encourage you to do, if you're uncertain, take some time to reach out to the organization. Find out who their grants person is. Maybe you can find that information online. Email them directly. If not, find a general info email, send a message to the general info, or give them a call. My experience has been that most grants managers or program officers at an organization would rather you spend 10 or 15 minutes via email or on the phone to get better understanding of what the grant is, so you don't waste your time filling out an application that may just not be suitable, right? And certainly it saves them time in the long run, because whenever you submit an application that just isn't right, they still have to review it, right? They still have to process it. They have to deny the application if it's not right. So that time that the grant officer or the program officer spends up front to help you talk through ideas is really going to benefit them as well as you. And my experience has been here at Indiana Humanities, sometimes if somebody gives me a call, they may be kind of on the right track, but I can give them some ideas, some thoughts about how they can shape it. And they often find that helpful. So if you don't find much information about grant guidelines, or even if you do, spend a little time with the program officer or the grant officer to clarify. One other thing I put on this bullet is also, before you apply for a grant, see if you can find out what the grant administration guidelines are like, what you're going to have to do to carry out the grant. Make sure it's worth your while. If it's a super small grant and you see that you're going to have to spend a lot of time applying, and then on the other end, a lot of time reporting back to the grants manager, filling out final reports, budgets, things like that, you may find that there's a better source for the funds, that it's just not worth your time to fill out the grant. So try to, as you thinking about the grant and learning as much as you can about the grant opportunity, think through also what's it going to take to administer this grant, because that's an important step in the process. Any questions now? All right. Preparing the application. So you've researched the grant, you think this is a good opportunity, you think what you're asking for really aligns well with the mission of the grant, the mission of the organization, and you're going to sit down, you're going to apply for the grant. One thing to consider, that many organizations now have you apply through an online portal. We do it at Indiana Humanities, the Indiana Arts Commission does. I'm sure the folks at Okra have an online portal as well. Most organizations nowadays will have you apply online, which means that you have to go in, you have to set up an account. And if technology frightens you, keep that in mind as you're working through that you're probably going to have to go online. As you prepare the application or get ready to, you probably, if it's in an online portal, most of them will have a chance to preview the questions and see what you're going to have to put in there. As I mentioned in our grant guidelines, I have them spelled out in writing. But if you don't see that in a particular grant guideline and you go online on the portal, see if you can preview the application and get a sense for what you're going to have to complete. A lot of grant applications, they're not just about answering questions. Many of them will require you to add supplementary materials. You might have to submit a budget. Especially if you're seeking programming support, you probably are going to have to put together a budget. Sometimes you'll have to fill out a budget template. There's an organization here in Indianapolis, a private foundation that we do get funding for. I know anytime that I prepare an application for that organization, I've got to put the budget in their particular template. And let me assure you, it is a laborious process, 2 or 3 hours to get that budget together. So, it's not one of those things where I can just pop in and get it knocked out and submit it. It takes some time. Sometimes the materials that you won't be asked to provide will take some time to get. You may need to search for your IRS determination letter. Sometimes, this is the case with our grants, you may have to ask people to write letters of support. You can't just ask somebody to say, hey, I've got an application due in 2 hours. Could you write this letter? So make sure when you go in the portal that you understand, what that application process looks like, read the questions, know what some materials you're going to have to submit. That will be helpful for you. I think I talk about this later, but give yourself time. Yeah, most grant applications, you're not going to be able to wait to the last minute before the deadline and expect to put an application together in an hour and get it in there. That's not going to be effective. Allow yourself plenty of time to get the application together. Make sure you pay attention to deadlines too. If you know of an opportunity, get in right away to see what their deadlines are. Sometimes if you're a first-time grant applicant to this organization, they'll maybe have you submit a letter of inquiry or some sort of free application. So there may be some additional steps involved, especially if you're new. So just be careful about timelines and allow yourself plenty of time. As you're preparing the narrative questions, some tips for you. Provide details in a succinct manner. As you're answering the questions, make sure that you actually answer the questions that they pose. In our application, we say, tell us about the project. What are you hoping to accomplish? Make sure that you answer the question, that you give specific details about what the project entails. I often find that the people will have sort of pie in the sky ideas, and the reviewers come away saying, we don't know what they're going to do. So focus on the basics, the who, the what, the when, the where, and the why. Keep in mind who your audience is. That means as you're writing the application, the narrative questions, like always remember, from whom are we seeking this grant? What's this organization's mission? What's important to them? And shape your answers accordingly. Another thing to keep in mind is that the reviewers that are going to read through this application, they're not going to know probably a whole lot about your organization. So don't make assumptions. Give them the information they need as someone with no knowledge of your organization, that they understand it in a meaningful way, which means avoid jargon, right? Don't make assumptions about what they'll know. Again, straightforward answers. And read carefully the questions. And as you're reading your answers, I will always say, don't just type an answer and move on. Like, go back and read your response. Wait a day or two. When your application is complete, go back and read your response and read the question closely and say, did I answer this question for someone who doesn't know anything about my organization? And if you can answer that, yeah, I think I've given them what they need, that's a good sign. You will see that in most applications, they have certain word limits or character limits. I have had times where, oh my gosh, my character limit is so short. I really struggle to provide a meaningful answer. That's a challenge. It's equally challenging sometimes, I think, when you have all the space in the world, because then you can just maybe go a little bit crazy. I think you find a balance there. If you've got all this space, really ask yourself, what do I need to provide this person so they understand what I'm wanting to do here? And resist the urge to just dump everything in there that's not insightful to the question. I will say, as a grant reviewer, like a few paragraphs for a question, and then I'm ready to move on. I may have a stack of 35 or 40 applications, so I really don't always have a lot of time. That's why getting the most important information in a succinct manner is great. Don't ramble on where you don't need to ramble on, but provide them the information that they need. Um, sell your sell your sell your program. That is an important part as you're writing your responses. Be enthusiastic. And one of the things that you should do is help the reviewers understand what is the impact this is going to have on your audiences, on the people that you're going to serve, on your community. Sometimes, as people are reviewing grants, they may have a whole stack of really solid proposals, but they often have to make tough decisions. I often say, when we reject applications here at Indiana Humanities, it wasn't that you had a bad idea. It really was a fundable project, but we had to make really tough decisions because our budget was limited. We could only award, say, 10 grants and we got 40 applications. So we had to turn down a lot of good projects. Sometimes what stands out is those applications that really, number one, again, provide the information the reviewers need, but also give a sense of, this is why this project is important. So know, as you're writing a grant proposal, you also have to be a bit of a salesperson. You've got to make them get excited, the reviewers excited about your project. You also need to get them to know, this is the impact it's going to have in our community and the difference it's going to make, and this is why you will want to fund this project. So be a bit of a salesperson as well. I talked about this earlier. Allow yourself plenty of time to complete your application. Do not wait until the last minute. I get applications in and I can tell this person didn't, they waited until the very last minute to get this. They don't have letters of support. They've blown through you can just tell when a person has not spent any time on it. So allow yourself time to get all the materials you need, to write your questions, to come back to your questions and review them. One of the things I suggest is have someone in your organization, or maybe it's a friend outside of work, review your application with a neutral eye. As you're writing it, again, you're going to come from a point, I know this program. You may, even as hard as you try, create some text that just, it's not coming across to the person who's not familiar with your organization. So I would say, if you have the chance, have someone else read through the application to copy it for grammar mistakes, but also for content and context. That's always helpful. And finally, if you work far enough in advance, some organizations will allow you to submit a draft proposal. and have their program officers or their grant managers read through it and give you feedback. Um, we do have that capacity here at Indiana Humanities, as long as it's limited. If suddenly I find myself right before a grant deadline, 20 people wanting us to review grant application, draft applications, we may not have the time for that, but generally we do if it's light. So just keep that in mind. And that's something that you can inquire with the grants officer, the program officer. Would I have an opportunity to submit a draft so you can review my narrative questions, my budget, things like that? And they can often do that. Depending on the grant cycle as well, if you've worked far enough in advance, you may be able to resubmit as well. If it's a sort of situation where maybe the organization offers a rolling grant. And that's what we do at Indiana Humanities with one of our grants called the Action Grant. We actually review that every single month. So if you have a program coming up, say in February, and you get me an application well, maybe say it's coming up in March or April, and you're really on the ball and you get me an application here in November, and we review it and get back to you in December, hey, it didn't go through, here's some comments from the grant reviewers. Those organizations can come back and reapply in January and get it back still in consideration for their March program. So working ahead has its benefits. I know that's not always feasible. I know sometimes you're working, really at the last minute to put programs together, but the farther in advance you can work to develop your programs and get your grant application in, that's going to serve you better. Okay, so you've written the grant application. You've done a good job of getting your colleagues' feedback. You feel like the narrative part is really strong. You've put together a solid budget. You've provided all the supplementary information that they've asked for, and you send that application off. What do? First of all, breathe a sigh of relief. This has been a big process. It's probably taken you a lot of time and energy, and you're done. So congratulations to you. Do take a note of when the timeline that the grant maker has given you. Note when they said that they'll get back to you, and keep that in your mind. If you don't hear back from them, I would say give a week, give it two, give a couple weeks. And if you still haven't heard, it doesn't hurt to follow up and just say, hey, submitted this application. We're really excited. Just wanted to know if you have made a decision yet. It doesn't hurt to do that. We'll get back with you and kind of say the state of things. I had a call last week that said, hey, I'm waiting for the review for this historic preservation education grant. And I was able to tell him, hey, that review has been a little bit delayed because our partner, Indiana Landmarks, had their historic preservation conference in late October, and we just had to push the review back a bit. Doesn't hurt to reach out if you're waiting. If you get the word about the grant, congratulations, celebrate that. You've got the funding, and that's worth a party, right? Allows you to do some important stuff. If you do get a grant, make sure that you're on the lookout for the paperwork. If it's an online portal like ours is, you'll probably get a lot of your paperwork electronically. You'll have to go into the system and sign your agreement. You'll have to go in the system, file your reports. Make sure you understand what's expected of you. Do you have to file an interim report? If so, when is that due? Do you have to file a final report? You probably will have to do that. When is that due? If I make changes to my program, I need to shift the budget. What's the process for doing that? That's important if you get a grant, to make sure that you fully understand what you need to do to comply with the grant maker's requirements. If you don't get a grant, that's okay. Sometimes they're really competitive. It doesn't mean you didn't do a good job. It does not mean that your program wasn't worthy. It may just mean that A, it wasn't a good fit, despite the research you did. B, maybe the organization just didn't have enough funds to provide support for every program that they received applications for. What I would say is, feel free to reach out to, again, the grants manager, the program officer, and just say, hey, do you have any specific feedback that you can provide for me? Is there a chance to make this application better in the future? many organizations have multiple grant cycles. So if you didn't get a grant and you can talk and get some feedback, and if the grant manager tells you, here's why, and we do think that this could potentially receive funding in the future, figure it out and, make the revisions as needed and submit again. Don't be afraid to ask for feedback. Most grant managers or program officers will provide constructive feedback and help you. That's what we're here for. And so that's really my the part that I have on the writing, seeking of grants and writing grant proposals. I will say that, of course, this has been a 40-minute talk. I've talked a little bit longer than expected. That's okay. I think we have an hour. This is just sort of the tip of the iceberg. If you want to learn more, put together a few little resources. We are very lucky in Indiana to have a wonderful academic program. IU has a school of philanthropy, but through the School of Philanthropy, they have a fundraising school that offers public programs for people like you that want to learn how to raise funds. They have a whole roster of different courses you can take. Um, I'm probably going to take a, a program on planned giving next spring, but I'm sure that they probably have specific programs on writing grant proposals. They have programs more broadly on fundraising 101. That's a really great resource. Some of the programs, as you can guess nowadays, are virtual. So you can register and you can take the course from the comfort of your office or your home. Some are in person, and if you want that in-person experience, you can come down to Indianapolis. Maybe it's a day-long program, maybe it'll be a 2 or 3 day program, but you can stay here and have a good time and learn in person from the experts over at IU Indianapolis. The Indiana Philanthropy Alliance is also a great organization. They are a nonprofit that their focus is on supporting people who make grants, but they have a lot of resources for people seeking grants as well. They have workshops and things like that. Our friends at the community foundations, they give out funding, but they're also out there trying to raise funds to bring more funds into their community pools that they can give out to groups in their cities and their counties. So the IPA does have some really good training programs around grants, seeking funding, things like that. So check out their website. And I mentioned as well earlier about, e-newsletters are a great way to learn about funding opportunities. They're also a good way to learn about training programs as well. There are things like Not-for-Profit News, which is an e-newsletter based here in Indianapolis that you can subscribe to. I mentioned earlier Communique Online. Not only do they offer grant opportunities, they have a really robust section on trainings for, again, it's geared toward historical societies, but a lot of the trainings that they promote are good for any organization. They have a lot of fundraising programs that they link to, marketing programs, how to market your activities, how to, promote XYZ. There are some things that wouldn't pertain to you as Main Street organizations, but I think you would find a lot in Communique Online that would training opportunities that would serve you. So I put a link there to go to their website and you can sign up online. So realize that this is a journey. You're not going, if you have no experience with writing grant proposals at all, it's going to take you some time to get really good at it. But just start dipping your toes into it, continue to look at resources for getting better at it. And before long, with practice and with maybe a little bit of training, you're going to be a pro at this. So at this point, my official presentation is over. I would like to open it up now for any questions. I'm not sure, Shelby, if anybody put anything in the chat, but I'd be glad to entertain it. And I will also put up here my contact information as well.
Great. I haven't seen any questions in the chat other than some people having some technical difficulties, which
Oh, okay.
sorry about that. But does anybody have any questions? Not seeing any right now, but
Okay. Well, I don't know
thank
if
you for
that's a
some
good
info.
thing or a bad thing, But I will say that if questions come up or you want to talk again, you see my contact information. I will send Shelby the slide presentation so you can have that in case you want it. And that'll have my contact information as well. You can always Google Indiana Humanities. Our staff listing is there, and you can always reach out. I'm always glad to talk to you. I am a Main Street person. One of my favorite things about my job is getting to go to communities across the state and seeing the work that you're doing to improve Indiana communities. I'm a history lover, historic preservationist, so I love going to your downtown areas and seeing what you're doing to revitalize them. So I just come from a place where I have a lot of admiration for your work, and I'm always glad to talk.
I think we might have one question, but I
Okay.
asked if they could put their question in the chat just to make it a
Okay.
little easier. Well, thank you so much, George. While we wait on that, I will say that
Okay.
we recorded this webinar and we're going to be posting it on YouTube as well. So if there's anybody in your Main Street organization that you think could really benefit from this information, feel free to share that. We'll also be sending the slides out, like George said. Um, I can speak to the fundraising school. I've taken several of their classes and found them extremely beneficial. Even just like the large packet of information you receive from those classes is awesome and something that you can share as well. So appreciate that resource. But yeah, as for now, I'm not seeing any questions. So
Okay.
thanks everybody for your time. And like I said, we will be putting this. Oh, we will. Yes. So as far as attendance goes, this webinar when we end it, will send an email to us at Okra with everybody's attendance. So if you're a grant administrator, you will get credit for that as well. Thank you for that question. Awesome. Great.
All
Okay.
right. I
Thanks,
appreciate all of
everyone.
you.
Great. Bye, everyone. Thank you.